Welcome to History 1302. This is a lecture on Gilded Age Politics, part one in a 2 or 3 part series covering the politics of the late 19th century. In comparison to everything else that has transpired in the Civil War and the post-Civil War era, politics, especially after the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, has taken a back seat in our studies. I've lectured on the economy, I've lectured on immigration, I've lectured on religion and Darwin, I've lectured on everything else in a larger detail, except for the politics of that late period, especially on the national scale. The reason being that I have chosen, and most historians in a survey course choose to leave the political cases and the political drama of the late 19th century to the last moment, happens to be the fact that most politics of the late 19th century were superfluous, or at least the great weighty issues that are coming. Excuse me, it seems like I cough every time I lecture. Anyways, the great superfluous issues of the issues of the late 19th century are superfluous. In 1860s and prior to that in 1850s, you had the coming of the Civil War and Reconstruction. After the Gilded Age, which effectively ends for our purposes about the year 1900, you really don't have, then you have the coming of the Progressive Era, which ushers in a very different way to look at what the government should and should not do. Very different scale and scope. But if you think about this, and I would ask you to do a little thought experiment, maybe even put me on pause for just a second, but think about how many of those presidents after Andrew Johnson you can name. Now, maybe you've just did the pause, you stopped, but how many could you name? Maybe you were able to name an Andrew Jackson, but that would have been before the Civil War. Maybe you thought Theodore Roosevelt, but that was in the Progressive period. In the post-Civil War, pre-Progressive period, you're going to have a handful of presidents, and most of whom are frankly forgettable. Obviously, Andrew Johnson we've already dealt with, but he's not really considered Gilded Age. He is an accident of history. First president after Johnson, we've mentioned him before, is Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant was a great general, the war hero, and all those sorts of things, but as I have said on numerous occasions in class, his presidency is not going to be known for honesty or for basically being a good president. I still hold to the old interpretation that Ulysses S. Grant's presidency was at best a mediocrity, and I think he was actually a fairly bad president overall. Was he honest? Yeah, he was not corrupt. His friends were, but he wasn't corrupt. But at the same time, his presidency is of limited value. After Ulysses S. Grant, however, you're going to get a string of presidents that fit a mold. And as I have alluded to you before, the thing is about especially Republican presidents, and that's the issue, Republican presidents here. The Republicans are going to remember what is their hay, what is going to make them electable, bring them to the presidency. And especially in the early years after the war, even for 20 to 25 years after the war, the Republicans are going to go out and they're going to nominate a certain type of man for the presidency. Remember, the term we've used before in class is waving the bloody shirt. And waving the bloody shirt is a multi-task, it's a simple phrase to remember what you're up to politically. On the one hand, you're going to, as a Republican, you're going to remind the country that it was the Democrats that started the war, and that, by corollary, if you elect a Democrat to the presidency, or too many Democrats to the Congress, a civil war will happen again. The rebellion, the South will rise again. Was it true? Not really. But at the same time, this is politics, not, a model United Nations debating society full of honesty. The second thing is that positively, and that was the first part about reminding the country of the Democrats and their connection to the ex-Confederates, is that positively waving the bloody shirt basically says, who saved the country? It was us. It was we Republicans who saved the country. We freed the slaves, if that was something you were excited about. If you didn't care about freeing the slaves so much, but you wanted to save the Union, well, we did that too. So, positively, we saved the nation. We remind you of who fought the Civil War for the best of reasons, for whatever reason you want. But we are the ones who saved the Union. So we wave the bloody shirt to basically remind people that who were the saviors or who were the villains in that great drama. And as long as the memory lasts and the memory doesn't fade, and of course it does fade over time, and the hurt feelings start to recede slowly but surely, that's a winning campaign strategy. You'll see the Republicans run that really almost all the way to 1895, 1896. As you get further away from the Civil War, the strategy of waving the bloody shirt has less effect, but even still then, it is possible to make some hay with it. And so that brings us to the next step of the equation. So we've got the waving of the bloody shirt, Republican dominance in the presidency. So if you're going to do that, you're going to nominate people from who come out of the military. You're going to have in the Republican Party, and even to a degree in the Democratic Party, you're going to have officers who had served in the Union Army running for the presidency. Obviously, being a Confederate, or even being from a southern state like a Texas, or even Kentucky to a degree, will disqualify you from the presidency for nearly 100 years. Realistically, had Sam Rayburn of Texas been born and grew up in any other state except a southern state, he probably would have been a candidate for president in the 1930s or 40s. But all that to say is that because he came from Texas, Sam Rayburn was forever locked into the House of Representatives. He could never rise above that, in a sense. And I think that was fine by him. But so you're going to nominate somebody from the North. That's the first thing. But as I've said also to you before, the person you're going to nominate is going to come not just from the North, but also probably from Ohio. So Ohio is your next step on the equation. And the phrase I think I might have used before, some are born to greatness, some achieve it, others just come from Ohio. So you want a Union general or a Union officer, at least the early days it'll be a general like a Grant or others. And then you also want somebody who is probably from Ohio. Ohio was a big state. Ohio was representative of the nation. The thinking was that he's not considered crazy because he came from New York, which is, of course, a big state in its own right at that time, bigger than in proportion to the Union in the United States than it is today. So you take an Ohioan who is a Midwesterner. He comes from a proportional state that represents the Union. He can carry Ohio. He can probably carry the country. To be fair and remember this point, to the present time, this lecture is being recorded in 2020. There has never been a Republican president who has been elected without carrying the state of Ohio. For whatever reason, perhaps it's just a fluke of history and statistics. The state of Ohio is extraordinarily important to the welfare and to the electability of Republicans. If they can't carry Ohio, they generally don't become president. If there has never been a Republican who has been elected president without carrying Ohio. So you got to carry Ohio if you're a Republican to the present time. So in 1876, this man's name has already been in your notes once before with the close of Reconstruction. And 1876 was a very controversial election year. And the man who's going to be elected in 1876 is a fellow, a Union general from Ohio. He'd been in politics, so he wasn't completely a novice. But the man's name was Rutherford B. Hayes. Well, General Hayes was a good man, but his presidency is touched, and it is going to be affected. It'll be actually tarnished by the scandal of the 1876 election and those disputed electoral votes out of South Carolina and Louisiana. He gets the presidency, but because of the scandal around the election of 76 and because of the scandals of the Grant administration, Hayes' presidency is really going to be doomed to a one-term affair. He was a good man. Hayes himself was an earnest man who loved his wife, loved his family, and not to my knowledge anyways, not a stench or a stigma of corruption was attached to him other than the normal grubby stuff that comes with politics. But General Hayes as president was largely forgettable. And then there's a whole lot of forgettable presidents, one after the other. One historian said that they were all these presidents of the Gilded Age in the late 19th century were overfed, overstuffed old men. And there's a lot of truth in that statement. So Hayes runs his presidency. But it is worth noting, take a bit of mention about his wife. Her name was Lucy Hayes. Now, Lucy Hayes is a historical figure. I'm not going to try to put her on the same level as some other great females of the past who have contributed mightily to history, as St. Joan of Arc, I guess Eleanor Roosevelt, though I have my doubts about her. But all that to say is just some characters, female characters of the past that were important historically. I'm not putting Lucy Hayes in that territory. However, what she does, and her nickname, by the way, was Lemonade Lucy. Nicknamed Lemonade Lucy because, and like her husband, she was a convinced prohibitionist, a convinced temperance promoter. And one of the things worth remembering when we talk about temperance, that idea that the country needed to get past and needed to arrest the free-flowing alcohol and to restrict alcohol in the United States. Temperance is a major issue in the late 19th century. Those of you watching this, you may be laughing. You say, what a bunch of rubes and fools for thinking that they could get rid of alcohol. Alcohol is as American as, or as apple pie. Alcohol is as endemic to the human condition as is perhaps life in air itself. And that may be true in a sense. But I would ask you to at least pause a moment after you get done laughing at those fools of the past for why they were against alcohol. And by the way, I imbibe myself, so don't think I am a sympathetic in the main to the idea of banning alcohol. I'm not. However, it is fair to remember that in that 19th century period, there will be more than a few men, and women too, but more than a few men who are going to wreck their lives and their families and their part of society by the scourge of alcohol. Americans drank massive quantities of alcohol in the 19th century. We were nicknamed the Whiskey Republic. Depends on who you read. Americans consume on average, the American male especially, consume on average between 5 and 8 gallons of hard liquor a year. You may think that's not a lot of alcohol, but frankly it is. Even for those of you who can legally drink and who are watching this lecture, you try to consume 8 gallons of alcohol, of the ardent spirits as they called it. That's a lot of drinking. Well, that's all to say though, is that the social consequences of alcohol are quite wide-reaching. Classically, and sometimes overblown, but at the same time, there's a lot of truth in it, is that you're going to see those who drink too much, men especially, abuse wives and family and children, animals as well. They'll lose their jobs, run off, have affairs, get beat up, and go into debt, and spend the money and just bankrupt the family. Don't give a good moral example to their children, and on I can go. And so these temperance movements, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, which was a movement that was exclusively for ladies, or women's temperance movement, they were opposed to alcohol, and their goal was to promote the temperance or the restriction of alcohol in the United States, and they're successful. Another group called the Anti-Saloon League, which was co-ed, meaning it had men and women, they too were opposed to alcohol, and they tried to ban alcohol, and in some states they're very successful. This is probably the biggest social issue of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Again, we look at it today with hindsight and I think wrongly, frankly, as you can imagine, I guess, that we point and say, oh, what a bunch of fools, why did you think you could do such a thing? I think we should be more careful and more accommodating to our ancestors and to our folks of the past, that they were trying as best they could to deal with a social scourge. And they were successful. Many states, by the time you get to the 20th century, many states, Kansas, Mississippi, etc., and so on, are going to ban alcohol. There's a phrase that comes out of this movement called the temperance movement, a phrase called a teetotaler. That term used to be very common in American English. It's no longer common, in all honesty. I don't hear it much anymore, except for people who are older and maybe me. But when you called somebody a teetotaler, the meaning they didn't drink. And in the early days of the temperance movement, prior to the Civil War, people would sign their name, Nathan D. Giesenschlag, for example. And if I put a dash by my name with a T, that meant I took the total temperance pledge, meaning that I refused to drink any alcohol, that the most exciting thing that I would drink would be perhaps water or tea. And so we didn't drink. I didn't drink. I refused to drink on principle. Because early on in the temperance movement, you would have people who would say, I'm opposed to whiskey and bourbon and rum, the ardent spirits. But I cannot live without my beer. Say, if you were a German immigrant, famously with their beer halls in Greater Philadelphia and other German enclaves in the United States. Or perhaps you came out of Italy, and after the Civil War especially, and you said, I'm against the ardent spirits, but I must have my wine. And you can draw your things out there. It's hard to have a social movement trying to transform society when you have all these little caveats and set-asides and withholdings and so on. Oftentimes it seems in American history that the great social movements, the great movements to reform society, there's a aspect of American character, and maybe just a human character in general, that you have to go the whole distance. You have to go the whole way. You can't just take a half measure to get to the full steps. That may be true, it may not be, we can debate that, but the temperance people, what we could also call prohibitionists, they believe that the crying need of America wasn't just the banning of alcohol in the form of the alcohol such as whiskey, rum, and gin and so on, but banning of all alcohol. So the total temperance pledge, a teetotaler. But they were quite prominent. Some places a majority, oftentimes not. Some of these folks, like a Lucy Hayes, Lemonade Lucy, her reasoning wasn't just on the social ills and evils of drunkenness and alcoholism, but she was also a stout woman of the church. Memory serves, they were Methodist, I think. But anyways, you will find lots of Methodists and Baptists and some Presbyterians who are going to be staunchly opposed to alcohol on moral grounds. I think that they go too far personally, but that's a theological discussion beyond the purview of this lecture. But that is to say, though, is that they took it as a commandment that you shouldn't drink. Now, to be clear, to be fair to them, the Bible clearly speaks against drunkenness in the Old Testament and especially in the New Testament. Drunkenness is not okay. Go look it up in Paul. Go look it up in the words of Jesus, but especially with Paul's writings to the various churches. They're opposed to it. But saying banning alcohol, that's where I would actually draw the line. But Lucy Hayes and there were many who were religiously opposed to it. Some of it comes from the Bible. Why was the churches opposed to it? I think some of it also has to go back to that social issue. Think about it this way. For those of you who grew up in a church or went to church or know of church, especially those of you who are watching this and know that aspect of faith, Christian Protestant faith, you would understand and probably would have observed that most of the people who go to church, say 60% in some cases, maybe in some churches it's 70 or 75%, depends on the exact church. But it has been true basically since the beginning of the church, back to the time of the apostles, that most of the people who go to church and are regular attenders and adherents to the faith are they themselves women. Now, of course, until recent times, most of the folks who were opposed, until recent times, meaning the last 150 years or less, most of the people who are preachers or pastors or overseers or bishops, and it's frankly still true in a lot of churches to this day, that office is reserved to men. You can argue the merits of it, not my point here. But just imagine, though, as I have said to you before in a lecture with regard to the importance of a pastor in times gone by, and especially the 19th century, let's just say you're one of those women who has an abusive husband when he gets drunk, and your husband beats you and abuses you in various ways when he comes home from the bar, from this happy hour. Perhaps he's had an affair. He perhaps could even, quite tragically, before penicillin, give you a syphilis or other sexually transmitted disease because of his affairs, and then he comes and forces himself upon you. Imagine all that. Or maybe a fight broke out in a rural part of Tennessee. Where prohibition, the fight broke out at a dance in a house because two men got drunk and words were crossed. All that as a pastor, back to this issue of the pastor being prominent, this drops onto your lap. This gets into your church. It can wreck your church. It certainly is going to do damage to individuals within the church. So practically and theologically, you may come to the conclusion in the 19th century that the crying need of the country isn't just don't drink too much. It is simply don't drink because you're trying to help people out. So I think there's a religious angle, and if you ever wondered why Baptists particularly, the old joke is, and so I'm clear about this, I'm a Baptist, card-carrying Baptist, is the old joke was, how do you keep a Baptist from drinking your beer on a fishing trip? The joke and the answer is, well, you take another Baptist along with it. And that's why until the last 20 years, Baylor up at Waco, which is a Baptist university, had banned dancing on campus. All that to say, though, is that there, I think, are real reasons for the church being opposed to alcohol beyond the biblical ones that I might have mentioned to you a few minutes ago. I think it's a practical aspect. But the church isn't and the churchgoers aren't the only ones who are going to be against alcohol. And by the way, I'm going to be clear about this. If you're Roman Catholic in the late 19th century, in all likelihood, you're not going to be opposed to alcohol. If you're Lutheran, which is predominantly German in the United States and made up of German immigrants or second and third generation Germans, or more perhaps in some parts like around Philadelphia, you're probably not opposed to alcohol. But really, if you're Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist, and a few others like that, which are very big, yeah, you would be. Or at least potentially you get opposed to it. But to move on, though, is you're also going to see in the late 19th and early 20th century a lot of secular types of individuals who may go to church, but church is confined to that Sunday-only sphere. We go to church on Sunday, and we keep our ledger book separate from everything else we do. So you have those sorts of folks. Maybe they don't go to church at all. That would be a fully secular man or woman. But they would say on the issue of the principle of the advancement of society, the betterment of society, the progress, hence the phrase like progressive, the progress of society, more efficiency. You see that a little bit with Frederick Winslow Taylor and the Taylorism stuff. The fact of the matter is you look at that part of society and you say, okay, we need to bring about a better society, a perfecting society. And it has little to do with religion, at least in a formal biblical sort of way. It has everything to do with either making money or just having a betterment of humanity, the happiness of man, etc., and so on. We need to do this on scientific grounds. We need to do this on the betterment of the uplift of society grounds, the protection of women, perhaps. And that actually brings me to something else. I'll probably repeat myself in a later lecture, but I think it's worth saying now, is that, believe it or not, with regard to women and the issue of women and suffrage, which is the right to vote, and women and prohibition or temperance, it seems to be that in the early 1900s, when prohibition is building to a crescendo, that it eventually gets it into the Constitution as the 18th Amendment, more women supported prohibition than they did suffrage. And the best way to look at it, I think, perhaps, and I'll come back and explain it more at a later date, is that when it came to prohibition, as one, and I saw this done on a TV show, docudrama, about a decade ago now, this old line feminist was talking about prohibition and suffrage. And when this docudrama was taking place, the set piece was about 1920, right, or 1919. Basically, what this old line suffragette prohibitionist was saying is that, and I would quote this in your notes now, is that prohibition protected the woman, or temperance protected the woman. Banning alcohol protected the woman from the abuse of aggressive man. And suffrage, the right to vote, empowered the woman. It gave her a vote in the ballot box. It brought her onto an equal standing with her husband or her male peer, her male equal. And I hadn't, until that point in time, I really hadn't thought of it quite in that way, and I think that's largely a correct assessment. So, but prohibition's a big deal. And Lucy Hayes, back to our Lucy Hayes person just as we go. Lucy Hayes is going to be a woman who is very much in favor of prohibition. She bans alcohol in the White House, will not serve it at state dinners. And so understand this, for most diplomats, when the United States when the President of the United States has a state dinner and he invites you, you're obligated to go. There's no waffling about, well, should I go or should I not? If the President invites you to his dinner table, you go because you're a diplomat and you want to maintain good relations with the most important single office holder in the United States. Memory serves, I believe it was Benjamin Choate. He was an ambassador from England. I believe it was Choate. But anyways, when an ambassador from England was asked and went to President Hayes' state dinner, and it was obvious that this English ambassador enjoyed a good drink or two or three after supper and before supper. He was kind of maybe Churchill-like, Winston Churchill-like. Churchill loved his alcohol. Anyways, this ambassador was asked after the dinner, and he said, "How was the dinner and how was the drink?" And the ambassador said, "Why, the water, it flowed like champagne." You know, the turn of the phrase. And so Hayes' presidency is, and it's in the main, in my opinion, is forgettable. But what his wife and what he embodies, at least on that temperance issue, are some of the coming attractions of the late 19th and early 20th century politically. What are the major issues that we must deal with? So all that's out there. So that brings us up to 1880. And as I said at the outset, Rutherford B. Hayes is doomed to be a one-term president. He might have, had the situation been different, he might have been okay to have a second term, but it didn't work out that way for him. However, in 1880, the Republicans are going to cast about, and they go to Chicago again, as they often did, trying to figure out who shall be our standard bearer, who shall be the man who will replace Rutherford Hayes. And so they've got choices to make. By the way, the Democrats have already made their choice by the summer of 1880. The Democrats, no primaries back then, no voting, no caucuses, nothing like we're dealing with at the time of this recording with the 2020 election process. The parties picked the man in the proverbial smoke-filled room, for good and for bad. So the Democrats in 1880, they picked their own general, who was, I have to look, I don't remember if Hancock, if he was from Ohio or not, but anyways, the man I would ask you to write down his name was General Winfield Scott Hancock, who served with abundant distinction in the American Civil War. He was really a great general. He was a hard-driven, hard-cussing, hard-fighting. He was a war hero. No two ways about that. And so he was picked to be the standard bearer in 1880 for the Democrats. And it's rather entertaining if you want to see kind of how you can read a little history by just looking at pictures. I'd invite you, and I might consider, I won't say anything just yet. I'll save it for an email if I need to. But I would consider, if I were you, to look up Puck, P-U-C-K, Puck magazine, and look up their editorial cartoons from the 1880 and other elections. Some of the funniest cartoons you'll ever come across, in my opinion, in American politics are in that 1880 election. And one I have in mind right now, and if I was in class and I had a computer right in front of me, I'd have Winfield Scott looking at the Democratic, there's one where Scott is being presented the Democratic Party by Democrats, and it shows all the skeletons and all the menageries and odd marriages of the Democratic Party. You'll see this and that, and Scott's kind of, Winfield Scott Hancock, General Hancock is taken aback, and he says, "Egads, I have to lead this sort of party." And then sure enough, yeah, that's what he had. But back to the Republicans, because the Republicans in 1880 are the dominant force. So if you think about it, what do the Republicans look for? They're going to be looking hard at, do we have another general for the election? And so the answer was yes. Ulysses S. Grant had 2 terms, but he set up smoke signals. As you well know, Grant was as I've said in class, was a prolific smoker. He smoked like a chimney, and so the pun is intended. But anyways, Grant will be trying to get a 3rd term. He'd come out of the presidency, didn't have much to do. He'd lost some money. He'd taken advantage of by friends. Well, anyways, Grant's tarnish had not completely worn off, and so Grant still had a lot of issues that he had barnacled onto him. So Grant won't get the presidency in 1880, though he wanted it. By the way, before I leave on and move on past Ulysses S. Grant, that's his last hurrah in public life, with this one exception. Grant, it was good in a sense for the country that Grant did not get the presidency in 1880, I guess, because Grant was, he didn't know at the time, and it probably had just started. But Grant was going to be terminally ill with throat cancer. As you can imagine, a man who drank a lot at times, but always drank, but more especially smoked as regularly as he did, is going to bring on some sort of cancer. It's just a common thing. You know as well as I do that smoking either brings lung cancer, throat cancer, or something like that. So in the case of Ulysses S. Grant, he developed throat cancer, and he's going to die very shortly thereafter. I believe it was 1881. You can check the exact date, but the story is actually kind of touching. Grant, had been badgered and had been begged by publishers, General Grant, please give us a memoir. Please give us your memoirs. Let us know what your thoughts were as being general. And they were going to sell, and they're going to sell greatly. And what Grant produces late in life, and at the end of his life, literally, he's 5 days away from dying. He finishes his memoirs on the Civil War. Grant's memoirs were probably the best set of memoirs of any public figure in the history of the United States. His writing is clear. His writing is concise. It's lucid. He's not always fair to some of his subordinate officers, I frankly think, but at the same time, it's overall a first-class work of memoir. He leaves the presidency out, which was just as well because that was forgettable. And he writes a set of memoirs about his time as general and an officer in the Union Army during the Civil War. The man who had really who helped Grant out, because he had to do this because his wife Julia was going to be destitute. The presidency at that time period obviously brought a salary, but in the 19th century there was no ongoing care of an ex-president. There was no ongoing stipend. There was no ongoing retirement for an ex-president. So when you left the presidency, you had no more money, or rather, you did not get a salary for being an ex-president. You didn't get a pension. And so Grant, there was no real pension for being a general. And on I can go is that Grant was not a wealthy man, and he'd been taken advantage of by friends, and frankly, he'd been more or less penniless as he's going toward death. So he writes those memoirs, not just for the sake of posterity, but frankly more so to protect his beloved Julia, and which he does. The man who bankrolled and helped publish those memoirs is Mark Twain, or a.k.a. Samuel Clemens. You know him from Huckleberry Finn. And Grant's memoirs are going to be one of the greatest sellers in the history of the United States. And Julia never had to worry about anything in her life. And like I said a few minutes ago, he finished those memoirs 5 days before he died. And if you've known anybody who's had throat cancer, no cancer is good, admittedly, but some cancers are more hard than others as far as the end stage. And the throat cancer is very painful, along with several others. But he had throat cancer, and it killed him. But he'd protected his wife and made sure she was not going to be tossed out. She would have money till she died herself. General Grant will be buried in New York City, hence the old joke when I was a kid, who's buried in Grant's tomb? The answer is, of course, Ulysses S. Grant, but at the same time, a hero of the Republic had fallen. And so he passes from the scene in the early 1880s, but that still doesn't get us to the 1880 election. And that in 1880, the man who is going to be nominated by the Republican Party is another one of those Ohio presidents, those Ohio running generals, and his name is James Garfield. James Garfield's in his late 40s, early 50s, late 40s actually. He is an attractive man, robust, strong in stature and health. He'd served in combat. I've already mentioned him in the form of him being a lay Baptist minister and what the Civil War did to him in his faith. But he saw combat. He saw the bodies. He saw it all. General Garfield was at Chickamauga in very northwestern Georgia, northern Georgia, across from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chickamauga is the worst battle of the West as far as numbers and casualties and so forth, and it's one of the few victories of that Western Confederate Army against the armies of the United States. Well, anyways, he was there, and he was at other battles, and it affected him. But he was a politician. He's from Ohio. He comes from the House of Representatives. He's a prominent man and an honest man. And he's what you can call in your notes a half-breed Republican. There was a real battle in the Republican Party in 1880 over the issue of should we have clean governance or should we continue with business as usual. The spoils situation, in the sense that, use this term in your notes, the spoils system, which means you hire your friends and you fire your enemies. Should there be a cleaning up of that? Some good government types said we must clean it up. Others said, well, we can do some work. And then there were still other Republicans who were called stalwarts, who basically said this is the way party politics are fought. This is the way government is run. You hire your friends and you fire your enemies. It's not corruption, it's just life. And so they're called stalwarts. Those who were opposed to cleaning up the rotation or spoil system were called stalwarts. But Garfield was a half-breed. He was a particular type of Republican politician. By the way, the term half-breed has nothing to do with race. It just is a political term for the era. But that said, is that Garfield is going to win the presidential nomination for the Republican Party in 1880 because he is that well-worn and well-trod and very effective man who had served in the Army. And so he is the answer to Winfield Scott Hancock of the Democrats. But the Republican Party was split, and the Republicans had to be brought back together by the choice of the vice president. And so the party, Garfield acquiesces to it, but the party selects a stalwart to be the running mate to the half-breed Garfield. And that stalwart's name, that Republican, was a corrupt crook. I mean, if you think somebody, say, he was on the same territory with Jim Fisk and Jay Gould and some of those others I've mentioned in earlier lectures. This man pocketed a whole lot of money legally and otherwise as the Port of New York customs collector. And that man's name is Chester Allen Arthur. But everybody called him Chet. So your vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party in 1880 will be Chester Arthur. President James Garfield against Winfield Scott Hancock and the Democrats. The election itself was run-of-the-mill for the time period, nothing that unusual. The Republicans win comfortably. I wouldn't say it's a blowout, but they win comfortably. The Republicans are the majority party. The bloody shirt is waved once more, 15 years out. It still works. But at the same time, perhaps you can see some erosion of that fact. But anyways, Garfield's the new president. And he sets to work in March of 1881, filling his offices full of office seekers and jobs and such like that. And one of the men who's going to come see him is an important character for history. You need to write his name down. His name is Charles Guiteau. Guiteau. Charles Guiteau. And that's where we'll begin the next lecture, with the work of Charles Guiteau and the assassination of James Garfield.